Welcome back. So we are moving into our new unit, which will focus on Old English. So we're going from the pre-English time to starting to look at what happens when English has separated itself into a language and the developments that we've seen both socially and also linguistically. So this lecture is going to focus mostly on the social and the political history, the different sorts of historical events that led to some of the changes that we'll see in the future lectures about the linguistic changes that took place. So this is also known as the outer history, but when we look at Old English as the language that it started becoming during this time period, there was a lot of variability, as you might expect with any language variety, and so Old English is no exception to this, and we'll see this throughout all of the other iterations of English as well. Variation and variety and variability is very common in all of the different levels of English that we'll see. In around 5th century Britain, which is around the time that we would say that English began to be seen as its own separate language from Common Germanic, Britain had a population of about 500,000 people or so, and this featured mostly small communities of immigrants. There were bands of mercenaries and invaders, and a lot of them were scattered areas throughout the region. So there were lots of different areas that were relatively isolated from each other, but which together contributed to the population you see there. People were, however, prone to mobility. This was known as an age of migration, so this did cause some language mixing, some mingling, some coexisting between some of the different groups. And so there was a lot of contact between speakers of other languages as well as other varieties. But we'll see that this had less influence on the development of English than we might expect with other areas, other examples of language contact over time. So there were lots of groups that contributed to the development of Old English, and a lot of these different developments of the language itself correlate with different historical events of the time period. So we'll be focusing on this lecture on those periods in Old English and the historical events that were associated with that. So there were 5 major periods that characterize the Old English period. Each of them is dominated by a central social event, and we'll see this throughout the history of English as it develops, that there were oftentimes sort of central social events that led to linguistic changes as well. So the first one, this is sort of the start of English as a language, as separate from Germanic, was the Teutonic invasion and the settlement of the British Isles by the Teutons. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. The Christianizing of Britain, which took place from around 597 to around 700. The creation of a national English culture, which took a couple hundred years during this period of time. Then the period of Danish and English warfare, there was a lot of political adjustment and eventually some racial assimilation between these groups, and this ended in around 1042. And then we see a decline and its objection of Old English due to the Norman conquest, which happened in 1066. So this is sort of the end period of Old English, and this period also sort of bleeds into what we might also consider the beginning period of Middle English. So we'll go through some of the major events and some of the major features of each of these time periods. So the first period, the Teutonic invasion and settlement, was the period where we would begin to say that English has become its own separate language. So during the Roman Empire, language was the Latin of the elite. They were the conquerors of the British Isles, but this wasn't the language of the people. Most of the people spoke forms of Celtic languages at the time, and the distinction here was that Latin was very highly standardized. It was codified, it had a writing system, and it was responsible for a lot of language shift in most of Europe, and it became the base of many European languages. So the Romance languages that we see throughout much of Europe, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, are largely due to the spread of Latin during this time period and earlier, so during the Roman Empire. There were really only 2 major areas where we didn't really see a shift into Latin taking place, and this was Greece and England. So Greek already had their own social structures, their own sort of history, and didn't fall under the influence of Rome in the same way. England was a little bit more isolated, and so there were some other factors at play there. And so Romans did conquer a vast region throughout Europe, and this centralized rule lasted for centuries, and Latin became a lingua franca in the region, which is how we ended up with so many of these Romance languages spread throughout Europe. And a lingua franca just means the sort of language that people are using if they don't share a common language otherwise. So we can sort of postulate and think about possibilities for why the language shift didn't really occur in England the same way it did in much of the other areas of Europe. But the truth is we don't really know the exact reasons why. We don't have a lot of documentation for this. So we do know that the Celts were a tribal society. They spoke a lot of non-standardized varieties. They were mostly illiterate. There wasn't a lot of writing taking place during this time period. And under Roman rule, where Latin was dominant, Celtic was a low language. So it's ripe for language shift. You would expect that because it was a language that wasn't in power, that it would be likely to be influenced more by Latin than it actually was. And by the end of the 5th century, by the end of the 400s, Romans and Celts had fallen from rule in the British Islands to these various Teutonic tribes. And the 4 tribes that have come in and sort of took over and sort of created the beginnings of English as a language and culture and everything else were the Angles, the Saxons, the Frisians, and the Jutes. So 4 major tribes that were responsible for coming into the British Isles during this time period. There's not a lot known about these tribes during this time period. They developed none of the social or political institutions that would have required standardized language, things that Latin already had, such as a centralized governance, educational systems, things like that. It was mostly farmers who locally organized on personal loyalty to a chieftain, which would have been just the sort of ruler of the town or the ruler of their clan or their group or whatever local region they were part of. During Roman rule, Teutons kept Romans out of their homeland, which would have been north of the Rhine and Danube rivers. So this is about where you would see the southern and southwestern borders of modern-day Germany. So the Teutonic tribes still maintained areas around Germany, while the Romans made it through most of the rest of the European continent, south and west of there. They did have contact with Romans, though, which led to some influence of loanwords. So the word cheese comes from Latin cassius, and so this was something that would have taken place much earlier in the language contact. So we have a historical influence of Latin in some cases, but not in as much as we might expect. During the Roman Empire, the Teutonic tribes did also want to expand, but they were sort of bottled up by the Romans. The Romans had a pretty robust empire, and they had a lot of control over the lands that they had taken over for a very large period of time. But over time, some of these faults in the Roman Empire began to start showing, and so as they started to falter, they were sort of seeking support from other more Romanized tribes that they had in their empire, and some of them had sort of imperial ambitions themselves. So the Visigoths that were in the lower Danube area went into what is now Spain from those to regain that area from other Germanic tribes, and they ended up creating their own empire when the Roman Empire fell. They also were Christianized through the influence of Latin. They learned Latin, and then this ended up becoming what is now modern-day Spanish. Christianity had a very big influence, and we'll see this more throughout this lecture as well, that led Latinization and led to a broader Latinization throughout the region. So the Franks overran Gaul, which is now present-day France. They were united by a single leader, and everyone was baptized by the end of the 5th century. And since Latin was the language of religion and administration, it ended up being adopted and became what is now present-day French. So even in the areas where they sort of lost control or they were sort of faltering in the expansion of their empire, the influence of Latin still remained in many of these areas. In England, however, there really wasn't a clear leader when these different tribes arrived in England. So once the Romans left the British Isles, the Celts had already been pushed back at this point, and the different Teutonic tribes that were coming in didn't really have a clear leader. They were coming from various areas. They were coming in to different areas, and so they didn't have this sort of sense of community that would have overran and connected them together. They also didn't really have any immediate military success. Most of their resistance was primarily among the Celts who remained. They sort of inherited authority of the islands over the Romans after they left. But the resistance was non-centralized. It was often very sporadic. So eventually, they did end up falling back, and so Celts who didn't flee or were not killed were likely absorbed into the general population of the Teutonic tribes, who did end up taking over. But there's still very little that's known about the relationship between the Anglo-Saxons especially and the Celts. So we have some indication that there was a runic alphabet that we'll talk about in the next lecture that was used for some inscriptions, but we don't really have a written history or account of the kinds of things that took place during this invasion. Their language, however, was not abandoned and was mostly just displaced displaced. So the Celtic language was moved into the areas that the Celts were sort of relegated to. So what is now present-day Wales and Cornwall in the far western parts of southern England, and the Irish islands and the northern areas that weren't invaded by these Teutonic tribes at the beginning. But when we're trying to decide or determine or understand what happened to the Celtic tribes and the Celts as a group of people, there's not really a lot known about this. There's very little known about the extent to which Latin was spoken in these areas by the Celtic groups that lived there. And it's really unclear why the Celtic language didn't have more of an impact on English development, despite the fact that they had outnumbered those who were invading. And there's a couple of different theories as to why this may have happened. So one is that there were Latin-speaking Celts that were in the area, but the Germanic invaders didn't learn Latin. The resistance was long and bloody. There was a bitter attitude towards the language, so there wouldn't have been a desire for them to learn Latin because they were fighting with the people that spoke it. There's also a second one that there were also Latin-speaking Celts during this period, but that the Anglo-Saxons were unimpressed with what remained of that civilization. And since Christianity was slow to reach England, Latin wasn't immediately incorporated into these areas. And then finally, there's the idea of Celtic-speaking Celts as their primary language, which is corroborated by some linguistic evidence of a Celtic-speaking population with place names that we find today, especially in the western parts of the British Isles, that would suggest a coexistence and a continued use of Celtic as a language. But there was a lack of loan words that would suggest that either they were slaughtered, they were sort of moved out of the area, or they were enslaved and not allowed to use their language. And the truth is, we just don't know if one of these theories could be more likely than another. This is just based on what little history and what little documentation we actually have of the area. During this time, there's also still a lot of other questions that remain because we don't have a lot of documentation. So other questions that we don't really have good answers to was, what was the numerical strength of the invading group? We don't know exactly how many of these people from the Teutonic tribes came over to the British Isles. We don't know how centrally organized each of them were or what their initial intentions were. We don't know things like if there was intermarriage between the existing groups and the invading groups. We don't actually know exactly how much resistance there was and what kind of battles or what kind of fighting may have taken place to replace the Celts with the Teutonic tribes. And we don't know what kind of centralization or military strength the Celtic population might have had during this time. And even if we knew these answers, it would still be pretty impossible to predict which language would prevail. Regardless of what could have happened, the Anglo-Saxons imposed their language on the Celts. The Celtic language was moved back. It's really now only surviving on the British Isles, in Wales and Cornwall, so the far western reaches. And so we can kind of see, if we look at a map of this, where some of these tribes came from, where they started settling, and why you can sort of see some of those areas that had pushed the Celts into those western parts. So you'll notice on this map that there's some different routes that are taken. The Jutes came from Jutland, which is present-day Denmark, and settled in Kent, which is in southeast Britain, so southeast of London. The Saxons came from present-day Lower Saxony, which is in the far northwest parts of present-day Germany. They settled largely south of the Thames River, so around London and south of London. What is now London. The Angles came from the lower part of the Jutland Peninsula, the far northern reaches of Germany, and settled in central and northern areas of England. And these lines on the maps are in relatively approximate areas. We're not entirely sure that this is the exact route that they took. We just kind of know where they started and kind of where they ended up. So it's possible that some of these groups may have actually crossed the North Sea from what is now present-day Belgium, because it would have been a much shorter journey that way than coming from those northern areas. So we actually don't know the exact route that's taken. These are sort of approximations, sort of guessing based on where they would have started and where they would have ended up. After these invasions took place, after the settlement of these Teutonic tribes took place and sort of they settled in, we see a period of Anglo-Saxon settlement and a period of Christianization that took place. So this is from 597 to about 700. And we know that the Anglo-Saxon groups reached England by sea, and this likely influenced the outcome of the invasion. So rather than having overland invasions, which could create different sort of dynamics in how you can invade, how you can take over things, the influence of them coming through the sea would have been influential, partly because their boats would be able to sail up these major rivers. So the Thames, the Humber rivers, were how they were being able to establish many first settlements. And so these were typically found along these major rivers that were navigable, that they could get their ships up inside into the islands more easily. The invaders took over a lot of agricultural practices. We see this through different archaeological evidence and some place names. And so there's some evidence that suggests that the settlers used some existing Roman roads and sites when it was convenient. So they may have taken over formerly abandoned villages. They may have taken over some of the trade routes and the Roman roads that were already in place at the time. And the Anglo-Saxons seemed to like a type of site that was known as a vicus. So a vicus during the Roman Empire was sort of a provincial town. It was a small governmental designation. In the way that they were using this in the Anglo-Saxon times was where civilians were settled outside of military centers. And we still see names that are sort of derived from these vicus cities and areas that were there during the Roman times. So Wickham, as a determination or a sort of name ending or beginning, derived directly from vicus, which meant vicinity, so settling within the local area around something like a military outpost. And then the witch or itch comes from wick. And this was used during this time to mean something like a port or a trading place or sometimes a farm. And so that was the kinds of towns the kinds of areas that tended to arise during this period of time. And during this time, there were new settlement names that were showing up, and they were overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon in origin. So the Anglos and Saxons were the ones that seem to have taken over most clearly during this time. And a lot of the places had relatively immobile populations after this time. Village life was often undisturbed by invaders, so there were a lot of divergences in local speech patterns. You can expect that these different isolated communities would have developed their own ways of speaking, and this is part of why there are such drastic dialect differences even today in modern-day England, because of all of this long history and long periods of isolation. Eventually, a lot of these smaller communities gradually organized into larger political units and into these sort of kingdoms that had developed during this period of time. So at one point, there were 7 kings that were constantly warring among themselves and trying to gain different areas of land on the British Isles. There were some more important kingdoms, and these ones will come up in our linguistic analysis of things, especially as we move into Middle English. But the most important kingdoms would have been Northumbria, which was areas north of the River Humber, so northern parts of what is present-day England. Mercia, which was the western areas. This was bordering what is present-day Wales. Wessex, which was the land of West Saxons, so south of the western part of the Thames, and so this would have been a little bit west of what is present-day London. And then Kent, which was in the southeast portion of the British Isles. And then there were a few other kingdoms as well, so some of the others were Essex, Sussex, and East Anglia. These terms and these names still exist in England today and represent where these areas sort of originated. So around the 7th century, when this time period was happening, we can look on a map and see where these areas were. So Northumbria in the far northern areas of what is present-day England, Mercia, which is further west and near what is present-day Wales, Wessex, where the West Saxons were, which is sort of south and west of present-day London, and then Kent, which is south and east of present-day London. And then you can see that East Anglia is sort of a little bit north of Kent on the eastern coast. Sussex is in the southern coast, and there's some other areas that have sort of names that come along with it, but that are less important for the idea of these different kingdoms. But these were, as these kingdoms developed, really important for developing specific English varieties. So we got different established varieties of English as a result of this, because there was more centralization, and that this would have led to more unity in how people were speaking. This was also the time where Christianity was starting to be introduced. So by around 700, England had been fully Christianized, and what Christianization did for this area was bring literacy, even though this was not synonymous with the use of Latin. So like other areas that were sort of Christianized and had Latin influence, there was Latin present, but it didn't influence the language in the same way. The areas were actually Christianized by Irish, and since Ireland was not in the Roman Empire, they had their own way of writing things, they had their own way of talking about things, so it was brought through in a slightly different way than what much of Europe experienced. And so when we're seeing these different varieties, we notice that though the Irish shared an alphabet with the Anglo-Saxons, each of these kingdoms eventually developed their own writing traditions. And so writing couldn't really avoid the influence of Latin. Christianity and Latin were inseparable in many ways. So much of the existing knowledge of Christianity was written in Latin. Most of the documents were things that were in Latin. And Latin would have been what was spoken in monasteries. So Anglo-Saxon scholars during this time would have been bilingual in using Old English as well as being familiar with Latin. And the adoption of Roman Christianity over time, after it was initially introduced, fostered learning. It created church schools. It created an ability for England to become an intellectual leader of Europe within about a century of this Christianization of this time period. So they very rapidly became a center of learning during this time period. And because the Anglo-Saxons had established these centers of influence in different areas, a lot of these kingdoms were seen as highly significant throughout the history of English. So our dialect differences today even remain showing what these ancient divisions were from this Old English time period. And you can kind of see, this map is a little bit hard to read, but it shows some of the factors influencing these dialects, where some of the travel routes were. So you can see some of the lines that show some of the major routes of travel and major routes connecting different areas, where Northumbria would have been connected down towards London, and London would have been sort of the center of where a lot of these things branch out. And so we'll see the influence of London and the eventual rise of London dialect over the discussion of the history of English, largely because many of these trade routes and many of these connections sort of led to that relative area. The next period of time, once Christianity had sort of taken over, we start to see this creation of a national English culture. We start to see a community forming, a larger grouping form. And so there were three major things during this time period that helped to develop a sense of national identity, a sense of an English culture among the Anglo-Saxons. The first was where the era of composition and a lot of different poetry began. So a lot of the earliest writings and a lot of the earliest documentation we have from the Old English time period comes from this period of time during the Great Poetry era. There's also a lot of time where there was Scandinavian invasions of England. So from about 787 to 878 is the sort of important time period for this creation of a national culture, but invasions from Scandinavian areas would have continued for several hundred years after this as well. And perhaps most importantly in this time is the very end period of this time, where Alfred the Great sort of entered this era of national unity. It's often called the Golden Era, and sort of reunited much of the British Isles together under one sort of rule, and created a lot of institutions that we still see influencing today, and things that we see today. So if we look first at the era of poetry, the 8th century was noted for Old English poetry, and there were several different kinds of poems that were very important. So poems were classified into 5 important groups. We had secular elegies, things like Wanderer and Seafarer, so you'll occasionally see some examples of the kinds that we saw there. Cadmonian poems, and these had pagan elements, but they were often blended with some Old Testament themes, so you get a lot of this sort of heroic verse and a lot of this idea of power. Genesis B is an example of this. We got Cynwulfian poems that were mostly Christian faith-based and had a lot of medieval rhetoric associated with them. There were later imitations of Cynwulf that sort of played on those same themes and those same ideas, but sort of expanded them. And then finally, just the masterpiece of the language, Beowulf, which many of you may have familiarity with or read parts of. This was seen as the greatest poem in any European vernacular prior to Dante, and so this has still had a large influence on poetry and our understandings of English literature, which is why it's so prominent in even today's literature classes. So we had this period of time where poetry became very notable, where we started to be able to actually look at documentation of things that are written down in English. And then we had this period of about 100 years or so of Scandinavian invasions. So this was known as the Viking Age, and this began about a half century or so after the composition of Beowulf. It lasted from originally the middle of the 8th century all the way into the early 11th century. And so there were North Germanic tribes that were attacking, they were plundering people along the North Sea and the Baltic. So this wasn't only the British Isles that they were attacking, they were also going into other areas of Scandinavia, other areas in the Eastern Baltic Sea. And so they had a lot of periods of time that this was happening. The most important being this 100 years or so, where the Danes were trying to take over all of England. And this happened and was somewhat successful in some areas in later periods of time. During this period of time, the attempts to take over Wessex in the late 860s were largely unsuccessful because of the courageous and military genius of King Alfred, who ended up taking over eventually. So in 878, King Alfred suffered a very disastrous midwinter raid, but he received reinforcements and then eventually defeated the Danish army, saved Wessex. The Danes withdrew to London, and the leader of the Danes, Guthurum, accepted baptism, political adjustment, and racial assimilation began. And King Alfred ended up taking over London shortly after that, and sort of turned attention to more cultural matters and sort of uniting the British people during this time period. So even with some of these sort of losses as well as some of these wins, it eventually led to Alfred taking over and creating what we know as the Golden Era, and Alfred becoming known as Alfred the Great. So there was a treaty in 878 that led to his rising, and until his death in 899, he achieved what we consider a golden era of national unity in England. So there were a lot of things that happened during this relatively short period of time of about 20 years or so. Politically, he remodeled the Kingdom of Wessex. He founded local shires for administration, so we get sort of administrative groups within the kingdom. In the terms of military, he created a navy. He had fortifications against future Danish incursions. He revamped the English army, so he developed a national army and navy as well to sort of prevent any further attacks during his rule. He also encouraged the growth of city life. So we see a move into more urban areas during this period of time, and we'll see how that influences language throughout the history of English. Religiously, he began to go into education, so he was educating clergy, restored a lot of the destroyed monasteries from during the war, especially in Mercia and Northumbria in the northern and western areas of England. And then scholastically, he began to welcome intellectual refugees from the north of England. He imported scholars from other areas to strengthen English learning and replenish libraries. So we start seeing a tradition of actual English writing, and not just things that were religious and not just things that were in Latin. So he founded a prose tradition of the English language. He began keeping historical records in English via the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and extended his learning in the area by establishing the first somewhat public schools that was designed to make noble sons literate. So there was an increase in literacy. There was an increase in using English as a written tradition rather than just using Latin. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is one of our best uses, our best documentations of writing during this time period. We'll see some examples of this in our class, as this was one of the widest and most well-kept historical records during this period of time. During the next period after his death, there was still influence from Danish areas and the different sort of tribes that were coming in. So from 899 to 991, the Kingdom of Wessex was dominated by what's known as Dane Law. So this was a Danish influence on law structures in Britain. This is sort of described as a set of legal terms that was created in the treaties between Alfred the Great as the King of Wessex and the Danish warlords during this time. And these would have been written following the battles in 878 when Alfred the Great took over. By the end of the 10th century, a new series of invasions was taking place, and this also included Norway and Denmark. They were also launching attacks on London. English tried to buy these sort of temporary truces, but it became very costly. And eventually, in the early 1000s, Sven of Denmark declared himself king. He had a sudden death, so his son Knut took over from 1016 to 1035. Knut's son Harold succeeded him when he died for a few years, and then Harold's half-brother Harden Canute took over for just a few years from 1040 to 1042. So from that early time period in the early 1000s was where these Danish kings and this Nordic rule had sort of reestablished itself and sort of taken over the throne during this time period. During this time period, though, there was also a monastic revival that was set up by Alfred. It was blessed by Edgar the Peaceful later, who reigned from 959 to 975, so before the reintroduction of Danish kings. And so this led to a reformation of British morality, this increased intellectual rehabilitation in England. And so before this time period of Danes taking over, the church again became a center for literary activity. Latin became more influential again in our vocabulary as well. So we can see both Latin and Scandinavian influence in the language as a result of these different eras of who's taking over, who's running things, the influence of Christianity and Christianization brought a lot of Latin. The influence of Danish kings brought a lot of Scandinavian influence. So some of the influence that we see in Latin, in later periods of Old English, Latin entries tended to be religious, literary, and scientific in nature. We see this throughout the history of English as well. Christianization introduced several words, at least 450 words into the language. About 100 were probably too refined to become common in vocabulary, so we don't really see them after Old English. But Latin had more influence in the written language that we see than in the spoken language. So the way that we write things down, the spelling of things, the words that were chosen to be used, influenced written language more than spoken language. So people that were not literate were not as influenced by Latin as the people who were literate. Scandinavian influence, however, was a little bit more democratic. So Latin influence tended to really only affect those that were literate and those that were in the higher echelons of society. Scandinavian influence we find amongst most of the people. So the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons, the Teutonic tribes fought hard against each other. Eventually they ended up sort of making peace and sort of intermarrying, eventually sort of merging together as one culture that was seen as about equal with each other. So there was more influence of Scandinavian language and Scandinavian culture in the everyday lives of people during this time, as opposed to Latin's influence just on things like religion and literacy. Linguistically, there was a lot of shared vocabulary already with Scandinavian languages, since they're also coming from Common Germanic. Old English and Old Norse were very similar in a lot of ways. They hadn't been separated from each other for all that long, really. So they had shared words for things like man and wife and father and mother and house. Eventually, when the Norman conquest takes place towards the end of the Old English period, this further reduces the difference between the English and the Norse and Scandinavian groups, because they have the influence of these French groups coming in. And so the influence of Old Norse was typically in very basic and commonplace everyday kinds of language. So this influenced our phonology, it influenced our morphology, it influenced our grammar as well. And there were about 1,800 words from Old Norse that entered into our standard Old English vocabulary. The final period of time, which would be the decline and the subjection of Old English, happens at the very end of this Old English time period, and you'll notice the dates sort of bleed into the beginning of the Middle English time period. So after the fall of the Nordic Empire, so the period of time where the Danes ruled, ended in 1042, and so they tried to keep some aspects of their empire, but with the death of Harden Canute, Britain was not really included in this, and Edward the Confessor, who was his half-brother, took over and ruled until 1066. So England failed eventually because Edward the Confessor was basically a Norman monk. He wasn't really a Saxon king, and his goal was not really to maintain this strong military might and strong military power. His years in monasteries made him pious, but he didn't really have this sort of ambition of control in the same way. And he maintained chastity, so he didn't consummate his marriage. There was no heir to the throne. And so he did nothing to really improve the situation of the people and improve the laws or institutions of this time period. So his rule was more about rivalry and provincialism. So the different local areas sort of ended up kind of ruling themselves and fighting with each other. He didn't allow the English army to start advancing different tactics. He didn't build any castles. He didn't rally any sort of support. He didn't really focus on militarized areas and military centers. And by the end of his reign, he had allowed Sussex ports in the southern area of England to fall into Norman hands. This opened up England for the Norman conquest that took place in 1066. So this Norman invasion is really the kicker to ending the Old English period as we know it. In the 9th and 10th centuries, there were Norse tribesmen that had invaded northern France. They fanned out into what is now present-day Normandy in northern parts of France. And the Teutons were very adaptable and fierce. They learned the law and military tactics tactics from France. And so by the time they had attacked England, the Normans were the most powerful nation on the European continent. They had been blessed by the Pope. They had taken over a lot of these areas that were once ruled by Romans, and they had learned a lot of tricks from the people that had remained in those areas. And this led to an invasion because William William, who was the illegitimate son of Robert I, was the leader of the Norman tribes. He was primed to take over England. He felt that it was rightfully his. So Edward the Confessor was his second cousin. And when Edward died, Harold, Edward's brother-in-law, took power, but did not last very long. So that happened also in 1066. This was right when William then invaded England. And England's fate was decided at the Battle of Hastings. This is sort of seen as the key moment that sort of ends Old English, begins Middle English, because the change of rule is really where the big thing happens here. So English resistance sort of dissipated at this time. It sort of dissipated into chaos. William took over England, and the Normans were brutal rulers. They engaged in a lot of massacre, slaughter, devastation. So they wiped out all of the English nobility and sort of took over the entire area. Within 10 years of the Battle of Hastings, all of the Earls of England were Norman, and so they're all coming from mainland Europe and sort of taking over the British Isles, bringing their own culture, bringing their own language, bringing their own influence during this time. So this was a super, super important moment, and this was what led to our transition into Middle English. So if we think about the prestige of language determined by the authority of those who speak it, it's during this time after William takes over that French becomes the prestige language in England for over 200 years. So English is sort of subjected to the language of the working class and the sort of just the lay people. And French nobility remained indifferent to English for several hundred years. They didn't really care about the language. They didn't want to learn it. They didn't want anything to do with it for as long as they possibly could. And by the time they did pay attention to it, it was already changing from the Teutonic, highly inflected Old English that we'll see the linguistic structures of in the next lectures, but it was rather already becoming hybridized Romance importing. So they were getting a lot of words from French. They were getting a lot of influence from French, as French was the language of prestige for so long. And it leads to this sort of hybrid change in what we see in losing inflections in Middle English, losing some of the features that we see in Old English, where Middle English starts to become a little bit more recognizable and closer to what we see in present-day English. So that gives us a really broad overview of the major social events that took place and some of the linguistic influences as well. In the next lectures, we'll dive into all of those different linguistic aspects. There are several different things, and there's a lot going on in Old English during this time period linguistically. So we'll look at those in future lectures. And as always, if you have questions, shoot me an email, schedule office hours, bring questions to class so we can talk about them if you want to talk about any of these kinds of questions when we are meeting together.